inside the underground war room of Tokyo's military headquarters. A single operator stared at a silent radio set, tapping the receiver again and again, waiting for a reply that never came. The morning had begun like every other tense wartime morning, but now something felt different. A coded message had arrived minutes earlier from a relay station south of Hiroshima. It contained only 3 words, transmitted twice for confirmation. Hiroshima not responding. Those words drifted through the room like cold wind. Officers paused mid-conversation. A general lowered his pen. The chief of communications leaned forward, demanding the operator repeat the message exactly as received. When he did, a thick uneasiness filled the underground chamber. Hiroshima was a major military hub, a city that always answered within seconds. Silence was impossible, yet silence was all they heard. Another attempt to call the city failed. Then another, static, empty air. No commanders reporting, no anti-air units checking in, no patrol squads confirming status. It was as if the entire city had gone dark at the same moment. In the tense quiet of the command center, the possibilities were unthinkable. Some whispered an air raid had cut the lines. Others guessed a massive power failure. But a few officers, the ones who had monitored countless American raids, felt something deeper in their bones. This was not normal. The air inside the room grew heavy as more reports trickled in. A weather station 40 miles away reported a flash brighter than the sun. A rail line north of the city could no longer raise its local posts. Every minute of silence made the atmosphere inside the war room feel tighter, more suffocating. Japan's high command, still unaware of what had truly happened, stood at the edge of a discovery that would shatter everything they believed about the war. The moment Hiroshima went silent, Japan stepped into the most terrifying unknown in its history. In the days leading up to Hiroshima's disappearance, Japan's war machine was already grinding on its last exhausted gears. By August 1945, the empire was cornered. City after city had been burned by relentless American bombing. Industry had shrunk to a shadow of its former size. Fuel was rationed so severely that even top officers often traveled by bicycle. Yet inside the high command, a stubborn belief still held firm. Japan must continue fighting, no matter the cost. The war room in Tokyo reflected this tension every morning. Maps filled the walls, marked with red pins where battles were lost and blue pins where hope was fading. Officers argued constantly about strategy. Some believed surrender would destroy Japan's honor forever. Others secretly feared that refusing surrender would destroy Japan entirely. But even the most pessimistic minds did not imagine a single moment in which an entire city could simply vanish. Hiroshima, in their eyes, was still safe compared to other targets. It had been untouched by the massive firebombing that destroyed Tokyo, Osaka, and dozens of smaller cities. Many in the high command assumed the Americans were saving it for a symbolic blow later in the war. Still, no one expected that whatever happened in Hiroshima on August 6th would be unlike anything in human history. At the center of this fragile military structure stood men who had been raised on absolute loyalty and unwavering resistance. General Anami, the war minister, believed surrender was worse than death. General Umezu, chief of the army, insisted the Japanese spirit could withstand any weapon the Americans invented. Even the scientists advising the military were cautious. But none of them predicted a weapon capable of erasing a city in an instant. This was the mindset, the fear, and the stubborn hope that filled Japan's high command on the morning they realized Hiroshima was no longer answering. The first minutes after Hiroshima went silent were filled with confusion rather than panic. Inside the command center, officers still clung to the idea that the blackout was temporary, perhaps a damaged relay line or a failed power grid. Japan had endured years of bombings. Interruptions in communication were familiar. But as every minute passed with no update, the uneasiness spread from one corner of the room to the other like a slow-moving wave. The communications chief ordered all regional stations surrounding Hiroshima to attempt contact. One by one, they responded with the same report. No signals, no traffic, no military chatter, no civilian distress calls. Every inbound line ended in nothing. Even the emergency frequencies, which were rarely silent, delivered only a hollow echo of static. Officers exchanged looks they rarely allowed themselves to show in wartime, looks that revealed doubt. A junior officer approached General Umezu with a fresh report. The man's voice wavered as he described what a weather observation post west of Hiroshima had witnessed. A flash. Not like lightning, but something so bright it washed out the sky for several seconds. The operator compared it to the sun rising instantly, then fading back to daylight. At first, the high command dismissed this as exaggeration caused by fear or confusion. But similar reports began arriving from other outposts. The same flash. The same shockwave. The same moment of overwhelming light. General Anami demanded an immediate status from Hiroshima's military headquarters. The response was chilling. Repeated attempts to contact Major General Shibata and the 2nd General Army resulted in total silence. These men were known for rapid responses. Their sudden disappearance made no sense as tension tightened. A reconnaissance plane was ordered to take off from the nearest airfield that still had fuel. The pilot was instructed to climb high, avoid American patrols, and report any sign of damage. While the aircraft prepared for launch, the High Command tried to build its own theories. Some officers argued that the Americans must have used a massive conventional bomb, larger than anything previously recorded. Others wondered if an underground munitions depot had exploded. A few quietly feared something beyond their imagination had occurred. Within the war room, the atmosphere shifted from uncertainty to pressure. One officer compared the spreading reports to pieces of a puzzle they couldn't fit together. Another whispered that Hiroshima might have been hit by a new chemical or incendiary weapon. Even the hardline officers spoke less confidently now, their voices low as they tried to understand why an entire city could go dark without warning. Every clock on the wall echoed louder as they waited for word from the reconnaissance pilot. Minutes stretched. Air inside the room felt warmer. Sweat formed on brows. The silence from Hiroshima remained unbroken. Outside the building, Tokyo itself was scarred by previous bombings, its skyline marked by ruins. But even those destroyed districts still produced some sound, some life, some sign of struggle. Hiroshima's silence was different. It was total. Then another message arrived, this time from a railway unit far north of the city. Their report confirmed something deeply unsettling. The line had seen a bright flash. And now all stations beyond a certain point were no longer sending signals. As if the entire region had been swallowed by a sudden force stopped by now. Even the most disciplined officers struggled to remain composed. They felt it, even if they would not say it out loud. This was not a normal attack. Something had happened to Hiroshima that defied everything they understood about warfare, and the reconnaissance plane, racing toward the smoking horizon, was about to reveal the truth. The reconnaissance pilot approached Hiroshima just after 10 a.m., climbing above the cloud layer before descending toward the coordinates he had flown over dozens of times throughout the war. He expected smoke, rubble, perhaps flame signs of another American raid. But nothing prepared him for what he saw when the clouds parted. Where the city should have been, he found only a monstrous rising column of smoke spiraling into the sky. The familiar grid of streets was gone. The docks, the barracks, the factories, the homes, everything had vanished into a vast, smoldering void. His voice trembled as he keyed the radio. Command. This is reconnaissance flight. Hiroshima. Hiroshima is gone. For several seconds he couldn't speak, as if describing what lay beneath him was beyond his training, beyond language itself. Finally, he forced out the words again, louder, faster, fighting shock. The city is destroyed, completely destroyed. I see no structures, no movement, no response from ground. It looks erased. Inside Tokyo's war room, every officer froze. Technicians stared at the radio operator, unsure if they had misheard. The message was repeated, and repeated again. Each time it landed like a hammer. Hiroshima wasn't damaged. It wasn't burning from a raid. It wasn't suffering partial destruction. It was gonna flattened, vaporized, wiped from existence in a single instant. General Umezu stepped toward the radio table, demanding precise details. The pilot continued his report as he circled the ruins. The blast radius was immense, stretching far beyond the city limits. Bridges had been torn from their foundations. Railway tracks were twisted into useless metal ribbons. The few buildings still standing were skeletons stripped of walls. Fires raged everywhere, but even those fires seemed small compared to the scale of the devastation. The pilot said it looked as if the earth itself had erupted. Then came the detail that changed everything. I see no aircraft wreckage, no bomb craters, no signs of a traditional attack. This was the line that tore open the High Command's composure. If there were no bomb craters, no waves of American planes, no conventional signs of assault, then whatever happened was something new, something far beyond anything Japan had prepared for. The pilot added one final note, spoken almost like a confession. There was a flash, too bright to be natural. It must have been some kind of new weapon. At those words, the room filled with murmurs, arguments, and disbelief. Officers who had once mocked the idea of an American superweapon now exchanged panicked glances. Scientists had warned months earlier of the theoretical possibility of a weapon powered by the splitting of atoms. But the idea had been dismissed as too complex, too speculative, beyond the reach of wartime production. Now, confronted with the ruins of Hiroshima, no one dismissed it anymore. General Anami, usually unshakable, clenched his fists. He asked the pilot a question everyone feared the answer to. Is anything alive? There was a long silence, broken only by static. Then the pilot responded in a heavy voice. I cannot see survivors. The destruction is absolute. A chill passed through the room. Hiroshima, city of soldiers, workers, families, children had been erased in seconds. And the weapon that had done it was in American hands. Japan's high command finally understood. This was not just a military disaster. It was the arrival of a new age of war. One they were utterly unprepared to face. The pilot's final words settled over the room like falling ash. No survivors. No recognizable city. No sign of life. For a moment, Japan's most powerful military minds stood in total silence, each trying to grasp what it meant for a city to be erased in an instant. But that moment didn't last long. The war room erupted into a storm of voices, fear, disbelief, anger, denial, all clashing at once. What had begun as confusion had now transformed into something far more gripping. The realization that Japan was facing a threat beyond anything in its history. General Anami slammed his fist onto the table, demanding order. Officers straightened, but the panic behind their eyes remained. Reports continued to arrive from nearby regions, accounts of burns unlike anything seen before. Descriptions of shadows burned onto walls, stories of people collapsing without wounds. None of it made sense to men trained to understand war through conventional firebombs, artillery, and aircraft. Some officers insisted this had to be a new incendiary device. Others believed the Americans detonated an enormous cache of explosives hidden within the city. A few whispered the word no one wanted to say aloud. Genshi Bakudan, the rumored atomic weapon. Months earlier, Japanese scientists had quietly warned that the Americans might be developing something extraordinary. But the high command had dismissed it as impossible. Now, confronted with Hiroshima's disappearance, the impossible was suddenly standing at their doorstep. As the debate grew more frantic, the room shifted from analyzing facts to confronting consequences. One officer argued that if America possessed such a weapon, then Tokyo could be next. Another warned that continuing the war might invite the destruction of every major Japanese city. A senior general countered that surrendering now would betray the nation's spirit. The conflict wasn't just strategic. It was emotional, personal, and deeply rooted in Japan's wartime identity. The discussion grew heated enough that even the most stoic officers allowed flashes of fear to surface. The high command had built its confidence on the belief that Japan could endure anything the Americans could throw at them. But how could they endure a weapon capable of burning a city out of existence? The idea shattered decades of military doctrine in seconds. Then came a voice that cut through the argument. A senior science advisor, pale and shaken, stepped forward. He explained that the reports matched theoretical descriptions of nuclear chain reactions heat beyond comprehension. Light brighter than the sun, destruction spreading outward in a perfect circle. He reminded them that Japan's own atomic research had stalled due to limited resources. The Americans, with their vast industrial power, may have succeeded where Japan had not. The room fell quiet again, but this silence was different. It wasn't disbelief, it was dread. Dread that Japan was now fighting a war it could not win. Dread that every city, every factory, every family could be wiped out by a single bomb. Dread that the Americans might already be preparing a second strike. Yet even in the face of this fear, not everyone accepted the truth. Some commanders refused to believe the Americans had cracked atomic energy. Others insisted Hiroshima must have suffered a freak accident. A few clung desperately to tradition, arguing that Japan must fight on, no matter what the enemy unleashed. But underneath the noise, something had shifted. The high command was no longer trying to understand what happened, they were struggling to understand what to do next. And as they wrestled with the unimaginable, the fate of Japan balanced on the edge of a decision none of them had wanted to make. Hiroshima was gone. And now the question was terrifyingly simple. How long until the next city disappeared? The shock inside the war room began settling into something heavier responsibility. The officers who had spent years demanding sacrifice now faced a future where sacrifice might mean the death of an entire nation in a single moment. News from the reconnaissance pilot continued streaming in, each detail worse than the one before. He reported scorched earth stretching miles beyond the city center, rivers boiling from the heat, and a black cloud climbing into the sky like a pillar of night. Even hardened veterans felt their stomachs twist as they listened. This was destruction on a scale the world had never imagined. General Anami ordered medical units to prepare for deployment, though no one knew what conditions awaited them. The communications team tried coordinating rescue efforts with nearby garrisons, but chaos ruled every channel. Soldiers heading toward Hiroshima described blistering heat even miles from the blast zone. Overturned trains, collapsed roads, and a strange residue falling from the sky. The high command struggled to convert these descriptions into a coherent picture. But the truth was already clear. Hiroshima was not a battlefield. It was a wound carved into the earth itself. As the minutes passed, the leadership attempted to form a response. But every plan they drafted was swallowed by the same crushing realization. A conventional bombing could be met with anti-aircraft fire. A naval attack could be countered with ships. But this bomb offered no warning, no defense, no chance of retaliation. The war strategies that Japan relied on for decades simply had no answer for a weapon that could vanquish a city faster than a pilot could blink. A science advisor warned them that the bomb's power came from a process that could, theoretically, be replicated again and again. If the Americans had built one, they might have built more. The High Command understood the meaning behind those words. Hiroshima was not a singular tragedy, could be the first of many. Tension thickened as debate resumed. Some officers argued that Japan must appeal to the Soviet Union, hoping Moscow could negotiate peace terms. Others insisted that requesting help from a foreign power would be an unforgivable humiliation. A few claimed the Americans would hesitate to use the weapon again, believing it could prompt unpredictable global consequences. But even those voices carried uncertainty. No one could guarantee safety anymore in the midst of the confusion. General Umezu leaned over the central map, staring at the pin marking Hiroshima. It had been a symbol of strength, a major military center supporting operations across southern Japan. Now, it didn't represent a city, it represented loss. Loss of life, loss of control, loss of the illusion that Japan could still dictate the direction of the war. A young officer entered the room with a trembling voice, carrying a message from a forward observation team. The message stated that people approaching the outskirts of Hiroshima were collapsing without visible injuries. The officers exchanged horrified glances. They had no concept of radiation sickness, no language for what they were hearing. Only the understanding that the weapon was still killing long after the explosion. The realization settled over them for the first time since the war began. Japan was defenseless. The leaders knew they had to prepare their next move, whether to fight on or search for a way out. But even as they discussed their options, a chilling thought crept into every mind. If America had already unleashed one bomb of unimaginable power, what would happen if they decided to use another? And deep inside the High Command, a fear none of them dared say aloud began to take root. Hiroshima might only be the beginning. Even as Japan's struggled to comprehend the catastrophe at Hiroshima, they clung to one fragile hope that the bomb was unique. A nightmare, yes, but a singular one. Perhaps the Americans had poured their entire scientific strength into creating just one weapon. Perhaps they had exhausted their supply. Perhaps there wouldn't be a second strike. That thin illusion held the room together as the hours passed. It was the only thing that kept some officers from breaking entirely. But just 2 days later, that hope was destroyed. On the morning of August 9th, as the High Command gathered for another emergency meeting, an urgent message arrived from Kyushu. The operator burst into the room without waiting for permission, clutching a slip of paper and breathing hard. His voice cracked as he read the report. Massive explosion over Nagasaki. City heavily damaged. Cause unknown. Possible same weapon as Hiroshima. The room recoiled as if physically struck. Several officers stood up at once, demanding clarification. Another weapon. Another city obliterated. For a few moments, no one could process it. It felt impossible, unreal until additional messages began arriving from nearby observation posts. They described another blinding flash, another column of rising smoke, and shockwaves that shattered windows miles from the epicenter. The descriptions were so similar to Hiroshima that denial became impossible. General Anami's face hardened. He had fought wars his entire life, sworn to defend Japan regardless of cost, but even he struggled to steady his breathing. General Umezu pressed his hand against the table, gripping its edge to keep himself grounded. Officers who rarely broke composure exchanged looks of pure disbelief. The Americans had not unleashed a miracle of science once they had done it twice. As the full weight of the second attack sank in, the atmosphere changed from panic to something even more intense, a crushing sense of inevitability. If America had 2 bombs, they could have 3, or 10, or more on the way. Japan's cities stood like targets lined in Fukuoka, Yokohama, Sapporo, even Tokyo itself. The High Command realized they were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting to survive the next sunrise. Reports from Nagasaki painted an image just as horrifying as Hiroshima. Witnesses said the explosion felt like the air itself turned to fire. Soldiers approaching the city described burned landscapes, collapsed buildings, and survivors wandering in shock, unable to speak. Observers spoke of shadows marked permanently onto bridges and walls, burned into place by heat beyond imagination. The details echoed the nightmare of Hiroshima, leaving no doubt that the same weapon had struck again. In the war room, the emotional barriers cracked. Younger officers expressed fear openly for the first time. Older generals lowered their heads, not in shame, but in exhaustion. Even the staunchest believers in resistance understood what the second bombing meant. Japan's military strength, already weakened by years of war, was now irrelevant in the face of a weapon that ignored defenses, geography, and courage altogether. A realization swept through the High Command. With terrifying clarity, the Americans were demonstrating power, not negotiating. This second bombing was a message Japan's refusal to surrender would be answered with more destruction. Each day of delay might cost another city, another 100,000 lives. And yet, even in that moment of overwhelming shock, a faction within the leadership clung to the belief that resistance was still possible. They argued that Japan must show strength, that surrender would erase the nation's honor forever. Their voices, though smaller now, pushed against the rising tide of fear, creating a conflict that threatened to split the leadership apart. But the truth could no longer be avoided. Hiroshima had been the warning. Nagasaki was the confirmation. The Americans had the power to end Japan in days, not months. And as that reality settled over Tokyo, the High Command faced the most excruciating decision in its history. Japan had reached the breaking point. The shock of Nagasaki's destruction hit the High Command like a tidal wave. But the emotional storm that followed was even more powerful. The room that once echoed with confident commands and unwavering declarations of loyalty now trembled under the weight of fear, disbelief, and clashing ideologies. Japan's leaders were no longer simply reacting to reports. They were confronting the collapse of everything they believed defined their nation. General Anami, whose loyalty to the imperial cause had never wavered, stood rigid. His eyes fixed on the map where two cities were now marked with black circles. His jaw tightened as he spoke, insisting that Japan's spirit remained unbroken. But even as the words left his lips, he couldn't hide the tremor in his voice. The officers around him sensed it too. The unwavering fortress of resolve at the center of Japan's military machine was beginning to crack. Across the table, General Umezu studied the growing pile of reports with a different expression, one of controlled desperation. He asked the science advisors again whether Japan had any chance of matching such a weapon. Their answer was the same cold truth. Japan's industrial capacity was too limited, its research too far behind. Even if they somehow started today, they could not build such a bomb before the country collapsed. The Americans had already won the scientific war. The emotional pressure in the room deepened. Officers who had spent their lives believing in Japan's invincibility were now forced to consider that their homeland was defenseless. Some stared blankly at the table. Others clenched their fists in helpless anger. One younger officer, unable to contain himself, asked a question that echoed painfully through the room. If we continue fighting, will any Japan remain to defend? The question felt like a spark thrown into dry grass. Hardline traditionalists erupted instantly. They argued that surrender would be worse than annihilation, that the nation's honor demanded resistance, that the emperor himself expected loyalty until the last drop of blood. Their words were strong, passionate, and rooted in decades of cultural pride. But for the first time in the war, their arguments no longer sounded unshakable. They sounded desperate. Those who favored negotiation countered with equal force. They reminded the room that 2 cities had vanished in 3 days, that Japan had no defenses against the new weapon, that every hour of indecision risked another catastrophe. They spoke of duty to protect civilians, families, the remnants of the nation's future. This clash of ideologies created an emotional divide so sharp it felt like a physical line splitting the room in 2. The war itself had become secondary. The real battle now was between pride and survival. Meanwhile, new reports continued arriving from Nagasaki, reports that felt like echoes of Hiroshima. Flames consuming entire districts. Survivors staggering in shock. Hospitals collapsing under the weight of casualties with injuries no doctor had ever seen. The details tore at the officers emotionally, forcing them to confront a truth they could no longer evade. The weapon inflicted suffering beyond anything in their military or cultural understanding. A science officer stepped forward again, his voice low but certain. He explained that radiation from the blasts would continue killing for weeks, months, maybe even longer. The devastation wasn't just immediate, it was enduring. The high command listened in horrified silence. The weapon wasn't just powerful. It was merciless. As the emotional tension hit its peak, the atmosphere inside the war room changed once more. Fear turned into reflection, reflection into conflict, conflict into a heavy awareness that Japan stood at a crossroads unlike any in its history. They could cling to honor and risk annihilation, or they could confront the unbearable truth that surrender might be the only way to preserve what remained of their nation. The question now lingered in every corner of the room, gripping the hearts of every officer, with cities vanishing and the unknown looming over every decision. How long could Japan remain standing? The high command had reached the edge of an emotional cliff. Hiroshima had shaken them. Nagasaki had broken them. But now came the moment that would determine Japan's fate. Inside the dim war room, lit by flickering lamps and the dull glow of radio panels, the debate no longer felt like strategy, it felt like a nation fighting for its final breath. The tension snapped when the door slid open and a messenger stepped inside, carrying a sealed document bearing the imperial crest. Every officer straightened instantly. The emperor's communication was rare, reserved only for moments of extreme consequence. The envelope was opened and its contents read aloud. The emperor urged the leadership to consider enduring the unendurable for the preservation of the nation. The meaning was unmistakable. He was urging them to consider surrender. The words rolled through the room with the gravity of an earthquake. For some officers, the emperor's guidance offered a path through the storm. For others, it felt like a betrayal of everything they had sworn to protect. But regardless of personal feelings, every officer understood one reality. The emperor's message changed the rules. General Umezu spoke first, his voice quieter than usual. He emphasized that Japan faced not a conventional threat, but one that could erase the entire nation if the war continued. He explained that loyalty to the emperor meant not simply fighting to the last man, but ensuring the country survived long enough to rebuild. Many officers nodded slowly. The shock of Nagasaki still weighed heavily on them, and now the emperor's guidance pulled them toward acceptance. But the resistance faction was not ready to bend. General Anami rose sharply, insisting that surrender would destroy Japan's spirit for generations. He argued that negotiations would lead to occupation, humiliation, and the dismantling of the imperial system. His voice carried passion and pain, a reflection of his lifelong dedication to Japan's military ideals. The room listened intently, but even those who respected him felt the weight of the new reality pressing down on their hearts. A tense silence followed. Outside, Tokyo's ruins whispered reminders of the suffering already inflicted by the war. Inside, officers wrestled with their identities, soldiers sworn to fight, patriots sworn to protect, leaders sworn to guide. The hardest question was no longer tactical. It was moral. Was continuing the war true loyalty, or was it sentencing Japan to death? As discussions resumed, more reports arrived from Nagasaki. Hospitals overwhelmed. Fires still burning. Civilians burned beyond recognition. Radiation sickness spreading without a name or cure. These reports struck the officers with emotional force, reinforcing that they were not dealing with a weapon of war, but a weapon of annihilation. Finally, a senior advisor addressed the room with a clarity that cut through the chaos. He explained that Japan stood on the brink of losing its cultural heritage, its historical legacy, and its future generations, if fighting continued. He reminded them that loyalty to the emperor was loyalty to Japan itself, not to endless destruction. The high command realized they were trapped between two impossible choices. But the emperor's message gave them a fragile thread of guidance. Slowly, voices of resistance softened. The idea of negotiation gained ground. Officers who had spent their careers preparing for battle now found themselves preparing for surrender, not out of weakness, but out of responsibility. By the time the meeting paused, a decision was forming. A decision that no one wanted, but everyone understood. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had forced them to confront the unimaginable. The war was over. Whether they admitted it or not, Japan's leaders began to understand that surrender was no longer a question of honor. It was the only path left to ensure Japan would have a tomorrow. When the high command finally stepped out of the war room, the air outside felt heavier than the smoke drifting through Tokyo's battered skyline. Their faces revealed exhaustion deeper than any soldier on the front lines. The decision forming inside that room, a decision Japan had spent years refusing to imagine, now hung over them, like a shadow stretching across the entire nation. Word of the secret. Debates began to circulate quietly among certain government ministries and military offices. Though no official announcement had been made, a strange stillness spread across Tokyo. Officers walked with slower steps. Clerks whispered in hallways. Radio operators stared at their equipment as if waiting for the entire world to shift with a single transmission. Everyone sensed that something irreversible was approaching, yet not everyone accepted this silent shift. In the ranks of the military police and select army units, whispers of rebellion stirred. Hardline officers spoke in coded phrases, their eyes burning with defiance. To them, surrender was worse than defeat, was national suicide. These men believed the emperor must never speak words of capitulation. They feared that surrender would reduce Japan from a proud empire to an occupied shell. Inside the imperial palace, tension reached a boiling point. The emperor moved through the hallways with deliberate calm, but inside he wrestled with the weight of every civilian casualty. Every burned city, every mother who had lost a son to a war he had not chosen. His advisors monitored him constantly, aware that even a small misstep in timing could lead to chaos if the hardliners acted before the surrender message was recorded. Meanwhile, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, survivors wandered through wastelands that had once been vibrant cities. Families searched for missing relatives among the ruins, calling out names that would never be answered. Hospitals overflowed with patients suffering from burns, collapsing organs, and mysterious symptoms that doctors could not identify. The stories reaching Tokyo were devastating and unfiltered, carrying emotional weight that no military report could soften. As news from Nagasaki intensified, the high command reconvened. The tone of this meeting was different, tired, somber, almost mournful. The once sanchical belief in victory had evaporated, replaced by the haunting fear that Japan had already lost far more than it understood. Officers who had been divided hours before now shared the same realization. The empire had reached a breaking point. But even as this internal shift occurred, The threat of a coup darkened the edges of the decision-making process. Some officers were convinced that surrender would betray the souls of the millions who had died. They believed Japan must fight until physically incapable of any resistance, even if it meant the total destruction of the nation. This belief, fueled by loyalty, anger, grief, and desperation, made the situation dangerously unpredictable. The High Command prepared to submit its recommendation to the Emperor, understanding that only he could finalize the fate of Japan. Every member in the room knew the consequences. Surrender could save millions but fracture the military, trigger assassination attempts, or ignite rebellion. Refusal could lead to more atomic attacks, Soviet invasion, and the annihilation of the Japanese people. Across Tokyo that night, as lamps flickered inside bunkers and shattered buildings, the city braced itself without knowing why. In the darkened corridors of secret meetings, in the quiet gardens of the Imperial Palace, in the charred ruins of cities that no longer existed, Japan waited. What remained was a single, fragile question hanging in the air: would the Emperor speak? And if he did, would the nation follow? The moment Japan had been moving toward slowly, painfully, inevitably arrived, just before dawn. Inside the Imperial Palace, in a quiet chamber guarded by loyal troops, Emperor Hirohito's voice was recorded for the first time in history. The soft hum of equipment filled the room as he read the imperial rescript, choosing words that carried the weight of a nation's survival. His decision was clear. Japan would accept the terms of surrender to prevent further devastation, while the recording was kept hidden until it could be safely broadcast. The Emperor's advisors knew danger was only beginning. Hardline officers still plotted to stop the message from reaching the public. Before sunrise, they attempted to seize the palace, searching desperately for the recording to destroy it. But loyal guards held the line, refusing to let Japan fall into civil conflict on the brink of peace. When the broadcast finally reached the nation, the following day, millions of civilians gathered around radios in silence. The Emperor's voice, calm, unfamiliar, and resolute, cut through the static. He spoke of enduring the unendurable and accepting the unacceptable. Across Japan, tears flowed freely. For some, they were tears of relief. For others, heartbreak. But everyone understood that the war was over in the High Command. Officers stood motionless as the message echoed through the room. Some lowered their heads in resignation. Others stared blankly at the wall, confronting an end they had sworn never to accept. Yet beneath their grief and shock, a deeper realization settled into the air. The atomic bombs had not just destroyed 2 cities. They had shattered the illusion that Japan could continue the fight. Hiroshima was gone. Nagasaki was gone. The empire was wounded beyond recognition. But Japan still had a future, and that future depended on the final choice they had now made. The war had ended. A nation would begin again,